To start a 501c3, I think it's important to understand, even before you actually establish it, to really be clear for yourself, what are you trying to achieve with the 501c3? And I'll explain what I mean by achieve because I think it's important. But I call it inputs and outputs. So in other words, you know you have a charitable mission in mind, but what exactly are you going to be putting into the entity itself? Okay? In other words, is it money? Is it cash? Is it intellectual property? What are the things that are going to be inputted into the actual structure? Okay, that's point one, and I'm going to flesh that out. And then point two, what are you actually going to be outputting? In other words, what's coming out of the charity? Are you giving money away? Are you giving scholarships to kids going to college? Do you have outputs like a program? Are you using a health and wellness program for inner city youth? So understanding the outputs also helps you begin to identify what are the appropriate structures. Okay, so it seems like an easy question, how do I start a 501c3? But almost like you kind of need to know what's really happening on both sides to the actual structure, so to speak, and then you can determine what is the best way to start a 501c3. Now, that being said, there are 5 types of charitable structures you can set up. I referenced this on another video. What that means is you can set up a private operating foundation, a private non-operating foundation, a public charity, a donor advised fund, and a fiscal sponsor fund. Okay? Those are the 5 types of charitable structures that are out there that a donor or a philanthropist or a charity founder or a social entrepreneur can set up. From your goals and aspirations, depending upon, again, what the inputs and outputs are, one of those or more structures are going to make an awful lot of sense. Okay? So from that standpoint, it really depends. If you decide that you do not want to establish your own charitable structure, okay, and those are 3 out of the 5 are your own charitable structure. Number 1, a private operating foundation is your own structure. You establish that, legally speaking, and I'll explain how you establish it in a minute. A private non-operating foundation is also a charitable structure that you establish on your own, okay? And a public charity is as well. A donor advised fund is not something you establish on your own. You actually establish it underneath an umbrella that's already an existing 501c3 public charity, okay? Again, I'm going to come back to that. The 5th charitable structure is a fiscal sponsor fund, which you also establish underneath an existing 501c3 public charity. So out of the 5 charitable structures that you have, 2 are kind of straightforward how they get established. So to answer that question, how do you establish a 501c3? Well, for 2 of them, you sign a contract with the existing 501c3. If you're going to establish a donor advised fund, you sign a contract called a donor advised fund agreement, and you actually engage the donor advised fund to establish this fund for the purposes of which you are setting out to do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about donor advised funds at some point. For a fiscal sponsor fund, same thing. You sign a contract with the umbrella that is the fiscal sponsor, and they set up a fiscal sponsor fund for the charitable purposes that you have. So those are 2 types, in some ways, kind of straightforward in the sense of establishing it because it's really by agreement as opposed to some function of law, which are the other 3 structures. The other 3 structures, you establish them through something called articles of incorporation, and you create an actual legal entity. Each jurisdiction, 50 jurisdictions in the United States, has its own set of rules and regulations how you establish a nonprofit corporation. Within those rules, depending on the state that you're in, you establish and prepare these articles of incorporation. You file them with the Secretary of State or similar state agency. Upon filing these articles of incorporation, which will state your purposes and a few other provisions that are important to the organization comes into existence. And at that point in time, you have a valid organization you get a tax ID number, you prepare bylaws, but you're not done yet. You're not done yet. And so in addition to that, as we've been talking a little bit about Section 501c3, you now need to submit an application to the Internal Revenue Service to qualify for what they call 501c3 tax exemption. So there's various steps in the process. It can take anywhere from 2 to 7 months for the IRS to approve you. To be a private foundation, a private non-operating foundation, or a private operating foundation, there's, again, specific rules that apply for that type of charitable structure. To be a public charity, again, at least 1/3 of your support has to come from the general public. Okay, so these are the types of 501c3s that you can set up. Donor advised fund and fiscal sponsor fund in some way are the easiest to set up, and they're also the easiest to dissolve. Okay? When you set up your own entity, you have more legal compliance, more reporting obligations, and also to terminate these structures requires more effort upon the founder of these organizations, more approvals and consent to actually terminate. So those are the structures.